What if I told you that one of the shortest questions Jesus ever asked was actually one of the most dangerous, profound, and transformative in the entire Bible? A question that didn't seek a right answer, but a position of the heart. A question that, when asked, leaves no one exactly as they were before. Have you ever stopped to think about that? Imagine the scene with me for a moment. Jesus walks alongside his disciples. They had already seen miracles happen before their very eyes. They had witnessed multitudes being healed, fed, and impacted by words that no one else dared to speak. They had heard heated debates with religious leaders, seen uncomfortable authorities, and perceived looks of admiration and rejection. It was no longer the beginning of the journey. It was an advanced point on the path. And it is precisely in this context, laden with experiences, expectations, and tensions, that Jesus decides to ask a seemingly simple question. Who do you say that I am? This isn't a question asked randomly. It's not curiosity. It's not insecurity. It's not Jesus trying to understand how his image was being constructed. On the contrary, this question arises at a strategic moment, almost like an invisible dividing line in the middle of the journey. And the most interesting thing is that, when he asks this question, the atmosphere changes. The noise of the crowds disappears. External opinions lose their power. What remains is silence. A heavy silence. A silence that reveals much more than any immediate answer could reveal. Because, deep down, Jesus wasn't interested in what others said. He already knew. Some saw him as a prophet, others as a teacher, some as a threat. But now the focus shifts completely. And you? He asks. Who do you say I am? Do you realize the weight of that? It's no longer about theology, tradition, or fine speeches. It's personal. It's direct. It's intimate. And perhaps that's why this question still causes so much discomfort today. Have you ever experienced this? Those moments when a simple question forces you to look inward and realize that ready-made answers no longer suffice? That repeating what you've heard isn't enough? It's precisely this kind of internal confrontation that this question provokes. And that's why it has spanned centuries and remains alive, echoing in the consciousness of those who allow themselves to listen attentively. What you are about to discover may surprise you, because this question reveals not only who Jesus is, but also who we are. It reveals our mindset, our decisions, our journey of faith. It reveals whether our spirituality is based on real experience or merely on inherited opinion. It reveals whether we follow Jesus by revelation or simply out of convenience. And perhaps that is why Jesus did not ask this question at the beginning of the journey, but after a time of living together, when it was no longer possible to pretend. Stay with me until the end, because understanding what lies behind this moment goes far beyond a biblical episode. We're talking about identity, hidden truth, real spiritual impact. We're talking about a point where faith ceases to be discourse and becomes commitment. And, as we delve deeper into this scene, we begin to realize that the silence that forms after Jesus' question speaks volumes as much as the words that follow. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when Jesus asks this question, he is not just inviting the disciples to answer. He is opening a space for something much greater to happen. And as we journey through this reflection, I want to take advantage of this almost silent space that this question creates to invite you to truly participate in this conversation. Because this type of content isn't meant to be merely heard. It's meant to be felt, digested, and shared. If this topic resonates with you, if at any point this question from Jesus has confronted you or stirred something within you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. Sometimes a simple phrase, a personal experience, or even a sincere question can help others who are going through the same journey, the same questions, the same searches. And if you realize that this video is helping you to see faith more deeply, to break free from autopilot and enter into a more genuine reflection, liking the video is a simple but very powerful way to say that this type of message matters. This helps the content reach more people who may also need to hear exactly this right now. That's how this message continues to live on, going beyond the two of us here. Now, if you feel you want to continue this kind of reflection, exploring the behind-the-scenes gestures, questions, and silences of Jesus, subscribing to the channel is almost like saying, I want to continue on this journey. It's not about numbers. It's about building a community of people who don't want superficial answers but are willing to think, feel, and grow spiritually together. Your presence here makes a real difference, And that's what sustains the continuation of this work. And while this conversation continues, because it still has much to reveal, keep this question echoing inside you, because the further we go, the more we realize that what Jesus was doing at that moment went far beyond a simple verbal response. And it is precisely at this point that Jesus' question begins to gain even more weight, because before going straight to the heart of the matter, he makes a strategic pause and asks something seemingly safer, almost comfortable. What are people saying? Who do people say I am? It's as if Jesus were opening space for popular opinions to enter the conversation. And they do. Some say he is John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets. Respectful, spiritual, well-intentioned answers. No one is mocking. On the contrary, they are answers that, at first glance, even seem complimentary. But notice, they all keep Jesus at a certain distance. They all speak about him, but none speak from him. There is a profound difference between knowing someone by hearsay and knowing them through experience. And Jesus exposes this with an almost uncomfortable clarity, because public opinion doesn't demand commitment. Repeating what everyone says doesn't transform anyone inside. It's safe, it's socially acceptable, it's even spiritually elegant. But it doesn't change mindsets, it doesn't generate real transformation, it doesn't redefine decisions. That's why Jesus doesn't stop there. He listens to the responses, lets them echo for a moment, and then completely changes the level of the conversation. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the real turning point isn't what the crowds think, but the moment when Jesus looks directly at the disciples and changes the pronoun. He moves from they to you. And you? Who do you say I am? Here there are no more ready-made answers, no borrowed traditions, no inherited faith. Here the question cuts through the discourse and goes straight to identity. Because when Jesus asks this question, he's not just trying to find out what they believe. He's revealing who they are based on the answer they give. This remains absurdly relevant today. Even now, many people know Jesus only through the opinions of others. Through what they heard in childhood, what they learned in church, what they saw in a video, what someone explained. All of this has its value, of course. But there comes a point in the journey where it no longer sustains. Because when faith is built only on what others say, it crumbles at the first crisis. A single question, a pain, a silence from God, and everything shakes. Personal revelation, on the other hand, is born in encounter. It doesn't depend on the crowd. It happens behind the scenes of the heart. And perhaps that's why this question from Jesus is so unsettling. Because it doesn't allow for neutrality. You can't answer it with "it depends," nor with "everyone says so." It demands a stance. And a stance always generates impact. To say who Jesus is not just a theological statement. It's a declaration about who you choose to be from that point on. Because if he is only a teacher, your life follows one path. If he is only a prophet, another. But if he is the Christ, the Son of the living God, as Peter answers, then nothing remains the same. The hidden truth here is that the answer redefines the entire journey. This contrast between popular opinion and personal revelation exposes something very human. We like to hide in the collective. It's easier to repeat than to discern. More comfortable to agree than to assume conviction. But Jesus doesn't build disciples based on consensus. He builds them based on revelation. And revelation doesn't come without risk. It demands courage to embrace a faith that doesn't depend on applause. A faith that continues even when no one else understands. A faith that doesn't fit into ready-made formulas. When Jesus separates what people say from what you say, he is actually separating surface from depth. He is showing that spirituality is not about accumulating information about God, but about walking with him in a living and real way. And this affects our identity, our mindset, the way we see ourselves in the world. Because, ultimately, the answer we give to Jesus reveals much more about us than about him. And perhaps you realize that this question continues to echo to this day, crossing centuries, cultures, and traditions. It reaches us in the same way, direct, simple, impossible to ignore. Not to embarrass us, but to awaken us. Because while we remain trapped in opinions, faith remains shallow. But when revelation happens, something aligns within. Something begins to make sense. And it is at this point that the conversation gains even more depth, because Peter's answer doesn't come out of nowhere. It triggers a series of revelations that completely change the course of history. If all of this resonated with you, comment at the end, "This makes sense to me." And it is precisely in this climate of silent tension that Peter breaks through the air with an answer that changes everything. It is not long, it is not elaborate, it is not full of explanations. It is direct, almost raw. "You are the Christ," for words that carry an immeasurable weight, because there Peter is not merely stating a correct definition of Jesus. He is crossing an invisible line between opinion and revelation. He does not say, "I think you are," nor "maybe you are." He affirms. And this affirmation springs from a place deeper than logic, study, or tradition. What's most interesting is what Jesus does next, or rather, what he doesn't do. Jesus doesn't applaud Peter, doesn't say, "Very good, you studied well," nor does he transform that moment into an exaltation of humanity's capacity to understand God. On the contrary, Jesus immediately shifts the focus. He makes it clear that that answer didn't originate from Peter's mind, but from something that came from above. "This was not revealed to you by flesh and blood," he says. In other words, it wasn't human effort, it wasn't intelligence, it wasn't spiritual merit. It was revelation. This detail completely changes the interpretation of the scene. Because Jesus is teaching something profound without raising his voice, without giving a long speech, simply by repositioning the origin of true faith. He is saying, in no uncertain terms, that no one arrives at this conviction alone. That the faith that sustains is not fabricated, it is received. That there is a hidden truth that is only revealed when God decides to reveal it. And this directly confronts our modern mentality, which likes control, method, and performance even in spirituality. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because Jesus' silence at this moment speaks volumes as much as his words. He doesn't debate with the other disciples. He doesn't ask them to confirm. He doesn't relativize the answer. He accepts Peter's statement because he recognizes its source. This silence is a powerful gesture. It's as if Jesus were saying, when revelation happens, there's no need to prove anything. The truth stands on its own. And this has an enormous impact on anyone's faith journey. How many times do we try to reach God through effort, through the amount of content consumed, verses memorized, and successes accumulated? All of that has its place, of course. But Jesus makes it clear that there is a limit to what flesh and blood can achieve. Revelation begins where control ends. And that's uncomfortable because it puts us in a position of dependence. Revelation demands humility. It demands admitting that there are things that only God can show. Notice also that Peter doesn't fully understand everything he's saying. And that's liberating. He recognizes who Jesus is even before fully comprehending what that means. Revelation comes before maturity. Conviction comes before all answers. This breaks the idea that we need to understand everything to believe. Often, true faith begins exactly like that, with a certainty in the heart that we can't yet fully explain, but that guides our decisions, changes our direction, and redefines our identity. And Jesus validates this. He doesn't demand that Peter present a theological treatise. He recognizes the inner movement that took place. This reveals something essential about how God works. He doesn't wait for intellectual perfection to reveal himself. He reveals himself midway in the process on the journey. And this revelation generates transformation. Not an instantaneous transformation of behavior, but a profound change of mindset. Peter continues to be impulsive, flawed, and contradictory at various points after this. But something can no longer be undone. He saw. He recognized. He was reached. This moment also reveals something about spiritual authority. Jesus makes it clear that true authority does not come from titles, positions, or external recognition, but from the source of revelation. That is why, soon after, he begins to speak of foundations, of building, of something solid. Because when faith is born from revelation, it becomes the foundation. And a foundation sustains even when everything else crumbles. It is a faith that overcomes crises, doubts, silences, and apparent contradictions. And perhaps here lies one of the most profound points of this scene. Jesus doesn't force this revelation. He creates the atmosphere, asks the right question, maintains the silence, and waits. The revelation happens, but it is not manipulated. This teaches us a lot about the inner workings of spirituality. God doesn't invade, he invites. He provokes, he asks, he waits. And when the answer comes, he points to its origin so that no one confuses faith with performance. All of this leads us to look inward and realize that perhaps the greatest challenge of faith is not believing that Jesus is the Christ, but accepting that this certainty doesn't originate within us. It finds us, it flows through us, calls us on a journey where not everything will be explained immediately, but everything will make sense in due time. And it is precisely there that the conversation deepens even further, because the revelation that Peter received didn't remain confined to that moment. It began to generate consequences, conflicts, and responsibilities that he never imagined. If this part resonated with you in any way, leave a comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's something about Jesus' question that almost no one notices at first glance. When he asks, "Who do you say I am?" he's not just starting an interesting spiritual conversation. He's creating a point of no return. This question carries a hidden, silent, but inevitable commitment. Because the very moment someone answers who Jesus is, that person also begins to reveal who they are willing to become. Recognizing Jesus as the Christ is not just accepting a nice theological title. It's taking a stand. It's accepting that if he is the Christ, then he has authority. And if he has authority, then my life no longer revolves solely around my desires, my plans, or my personal logic. This is the part that often goes unnoticed. Jesus' question is not neutral because the answer is never neutral. It always generates consequences. That's why this moment is so decisive in the disciples' journey. Up until then, they walked with Jesus, listened to his teachings, saw miracles, and participated behind the scenes of history. But there was still room for admiration without total surrender. It was still possible to follow without fully committing. The question changes everything. Because when Peter says, "You are the Christ," he is not only correctly identifying who Jesus is, he is, even without realizing it, giving up on continuing to be who he was until then. This is the spiritual turning point that many people try to avoid. Because recognizing Jesus as Christ implies transformation. It implies a change of mindset. It implies decisions that are no longer guided solely by comfort, status, or approval. It implies renunciation. Not in a heavy religious sense, but in the real sense of leaving certain versions of oneself behind. You can't call Jesus Christ and continue living as if nothing has changed. That is the hidden truth behind the question. And perhaps that's why so many people prefer to keep Jesus only as a good teacher, a moral example, an inspiring figure. Because these versions don't demand deep commitment. They allow for admiration from a distance. But Jesus doesn't offer that option when he asks this question. He doesn't ask, "What do you think of me?" He asks, "Who do you say I am?" It's personal. It's direct. It's impossible to answer without getting involved. This moment reveals something important about true faith. Faith is not just agreeing with a correct idea. Faith is aligning your life with that truth. And this has a real impact on daily life. It affects choices, relationships, priorities, small and large decisions. It affects how you deal with fear, failure, and frustrated expectations. Recognizing Jesus as Christ changes the axis of life. He ceases to be someone you consult occasionally and becomes someone who redefines your path. And notice how Jesus doesn't explain everything before demanding this recognition. He doesn't hand over a complete manual of what will happen next. He doesn't detail all the consequences. He simply asks the question, because faith isn't born from total guarantees. It's born from trust, and that's part of the journey. First comes the revelation, then understanding is built along the way. That's how transformation truly happens, from the inside out. This also explains why this moment precedes such powerful words from Jesus about the cross, loss, and surrender. It's no coincidence. The question sets the stage. Jesus knows that only those who recognize who he is can sustain what comes next. Without this revelation, commitment becomes a burden. With this revelation, commitment becomes purpose. And this difference changes everything. Perhaps hearing this question today will stir something within, because it hasn't remained stuck in the past. Continues to echo. It crosses centuries and reaches each person in a unique way. And every time someone answers, even in silence, something begins to change. Not always in an immediately visible way, but in a profound way. The journey of faith is not an isolated event. It's a continuous process of alignment, adjustment, and maturation. And that's precisely why this question still bothers us so much. Because it doesn't allow for superficial answers for long. At some point, life demands consistency. It demands decisions. It demands a stance. And when that happens, the question returns with even more force, not as an accusation, but as an invitation. An invitation to live a faith that transforms, that impacts, that goes beyond words and reaches daily practice. If this made sense to you on any level, comment below, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this question from Jesus didn't remain confined to that road in Caesarea Philippi, nor was it restricted to the circle of disciples. It has transcended time. It continues to echo today, silently, insistently, almost imperceptibly, but profoundly personally. It's not a question that comes from heaven in an audible voice. It arises from within, in the background of conscience, in moments when no one is watching, when masks fall and life demands a stance. "Who do you say I am?" continues to be asked, not as a religious test, but as a relational invitation. And perhaps this is the most delicate point of all, because religion usually offers ready-made answers, rehearsed phrases, organized concepts. Relationship, on the other hand, demands involvement, vulnerability, and decision. It is much more comfortable to know the right answer than to bear the weight of the true answer. And Jesus doesn't seem interested only in what sounds correct, but in what truly transforms. This question reappears in times of crisis, when faith is tested. It arises when a prayer is not answered as expected, when a loss occurs, when a difficult decision needs to be made without clear guarantees. In these moments, the question ceases to be theoretical and becomes practical. Who is Jesus to you when logic fails? Who is he when the old mindset no longer holds up? Who is he when moving forward requires courage and not just intellectual conviction? That's where a lot is revealed. Because answering this question isn't just about saying something about Jesus. It's about revealing the foundation upon which life is being built. If he is merely a distant reference, faith becomes optional, adjustable, negotiable. But if he is the Christ, it changes the entire structure. It changes priorities, it changes criteria, it changes the way we see success, failure, purpose, and even suffering. The answer redefines the axis of the journey. And notice how Jesus doesn't force this answer. He doesn't pressure, manipulate, or coerce. He asks and waits. Because what is born from pressure doesn't sustain true transformation. What he seeks is revelation, not repetition. That's why, even today, this question isn't accompanied by lengthy explanations or spectacular signs. It comes simply, directly, almost disconcertingly. And precisely for that reason, it's so powerful. Perhaps the most challenging thing is realizing that this question isn't answered just once. It deepens throughout life. With each phase, each change, each new impact, it returns with deeper layers. Who Jesus is when everything is going well may be different from who he becomes when everything falls apart. And that's not spiritual weakness. It's a process. It's a journey. It's maturation. In this sense, faith ceases to be a destination and becomes a path under construction. A path where old answers are revisited, where superficial certainties give way to more solid convictions, where mentality gradually transforms, not through imposition, but through encounter. And this encounter doesn't only happen in temples or solemn moments. It happens in everyday life, in silent decisions, behind the scenes of ordinary life. Jesus continues to ask who he is to each person, precisely because that answer shapes everything that comes after. It shapes how someone loves, how they forgive, how they deal with guilt, fear, and expectation. It shapes how they perceive their own worth and the worth of others. The question seems spiritual, but the impact is profoundly practical. It touches on work, family, choices, dreams, and boundaries. And perhaps here lies a hidden truth that few like to face. There is no neutrality in the face of this question. Even silence is an answer. Even the attempt to postpone is a form of positioning. Jesus does not demand haste, but he invites honesty. Because only from honesty does transformation truly begin. Without it, everything becomes religious performance. With this, faith becomes alive. When this question finds a willing heart, something changes, even if slowly. Faith ceases to be a set of inherited ideas and becomes a personal conviction. Not perfect, not complete, but real. And this reality generates impact. Impact on the way of living, of choosing, of continuing even when not everything is understood. Impact that doesn't attract attention through noise, but through coherence. That's why this question remains so relevant. Because it doesn't depend on a specific historical context. It adapts to each generation, each culture, each individual story. It doesn't lose its power over time. On the contrary, it seems to gain even more depth as the world becomes noisier and more confusing. Amidst so many voices, opinions, and narratives, Jesus continues to ask, simply and directly, who he is to you. And perhaps the most striking thing is realizing that this question doesn't come with an immediate demand, but with a continuous invitation. An invitation to walk, to discover, to adjust the course. An invitation to leave superficiality behind and enter into a faith that sustains real life. A faith that doesn't depend solely on ready-made answers, but on relationships built along the way. If this reflection resonated with you in any way, leave a comment below. I'm on this journey too. If you've made it this far, it's because this question has also found a place within you. And that says a lot. If this kind of reflection helps you see faith with more depth, more honesty, and fewer prepackaged formulas, it makes sense to continue this conversation together. Subscribing to the channel is just a simple way of saying that you want to continue exploring this path, with content that doesn't stay on the surface, but walks hand in hand with real life. If you'd like, leave a comment below to let me know you stayed until the end. You can write something like, "This message was for me," or "I'm with you until the end." This creates a beautiful connection between those on the other side of the screen and helps this space continue to grow with purpose. And if, at any point in the video, you felt that something resonated directly with you, consider leaving a like. Not as an obligation, but as a sign that this conversation made sense to you too. There's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic and delves even deeper into this reflection. Click there and continue reading.